Hello, folks. Welcome back to World War II TV and a new week on the channel. And to round off our Scheldt series, we are going to, for a more contextual discussion, looking at the general terms of the First Canadian Army in the early winter period of 1944. Our three Canadian horseman influencers are returning to tackle this subject. I'll bring them back in now. So, hi, guys. How are you all doing today?
Very good.
Very good. Thank you for asking.
Doing great. Glad to be back.
Yeah.
So we were just discussing that the whole Scheldt campaign, obviously a lot of the Canadian focus is on that Walcheren causeway, the charge there, but there's a whole lot more to it than that. And it came up with Stephen Fisher and Tobias last week, even when does it start? It's a sort of September, October, November, moving into December thing. But we'll kind of start off first with Arthur, our kind of German expert to some extent, to give us kind of a rundown of where the German army is, particularly the German 15th Army that's going to be meeting the Canadians here. What's the state of play with the Germans kind of September, October 44, post Market Garden or at the time of Market Garden?
The German 15th Army post Market Garden is still desperately trying to prevent the use of the port of Antwerp. They were very weak, though, and this huge withdrawal that had seen the German 15th Army pull back into the Breskens pocket and North and South Beveland and north of the Antwerp area. They'd seen them lose a large number of heavy weapons, and so there had been some combat, but it was very disorganized. There's no firm defensive line established. And it's so fluid, the situation, that the British 11th Armored Division, which is one of the best armored divisions in the British Army, captures the port of Antwerp virtually to no or little resistance, with help from the Belgian resistance as well. Of course, we're in Belgium in this area. But then the Germans begin to organize themselves on a much greater level and are forced into heavy combat by Market Garden, of course, and the absolute need to deny the supply dropping off point of the port of Antwerp. Thus, we see a tremendous fortification effort on the area of the Breskens pocket, which is encompassed by the Leopold Canal that goes left to right, west to east, and as well as the islands, South Beveland, North Beveland, Walcheren, and the area of Woensdrecht just north of Antwerp, which of course has the causeway leading out to South Beveland, which is the access point for supplies to the Germans. And as the Germans pull back, they're having a tremendous efforts towards escaping being caught in the Breskens pocket with all their troops. So a tremendous number of troops, almost 90,000 in the month of September, managed to escape to Walcheren Island as well as North and South Beveland, leaving behind the 64th Infantry Division, which fortifies itself within the areas and also carries out some flooding in order to increase the effectiveness of their defensive perimeter. But what is lacking with the Germans is tanks. Lots of artillery pieces, lots of mortars, lots of 20mm anti-aircraft guns, but only near the area of Woensdrecht do they have an armored unit, which is the 280th Sturmgeschütz Battalion, which is with the turretless assault guns, as well as a very good infantry unit, which they bring in, the 6th Fallschirmjäger Regiment, which is somewhat elite. But these German divisions are beat up, and they're not very well equipped, and their morale is not exactly high. And they, of course, they're not stupid. They can see they're being trapped on these islands, trapped in the Breskens pocket. The ability to withdraw or to see Germany again is fading. Now they're given these horrible fortress orders. You shall not know, not one step back. But they finally managed to organize themselves somewhat in mid-September, and they're forced into heavy combat during Market Garden, and thus the defense suddenly becomes very, very firm as once October arrives, and they have their tasks set out for them. And an interesting division for them is the 70th Infantry Division, which is on Walcheren and other parts of North and South Beveland, which is composed entirely of men with stomach ailments, either stomach wounds or, digestive tract problems. So they're all fed a special diet and all grouped together, but they still are able to somewhat fight hard. But this is one of the terrible challenges that is facing the German army at this point, is that the reserves, as far as infantry manpower, are getting very, very low. And what armor was available to fight is fighting market garden, or was fighting market garden as hard as it could be fought. So what's left to fight the Canadian army at this point? Luckily, the Canadian army is very slow to arrive and has been doing other things, assigned other things by Montgomery. And this gives the Germans a tremendous advantage in time, which they use to their best of the ability to get these defenses ready. So hopefully that, outlines things a little bit there.
Yeah, great start. So, Mike, I'm going to turn to you now, because you're Mr. Maps. So the Allies have had it's fair to say, since June, it's been a bit kind of 2 steps forward, 1 step back. They're kind of stuck in Normandy. Then there was after Normandy, the Falaise Gap, there's the Great Swan pushing up there. And then getting into the middle of September, the situation so often, as historians, as the viewers watching this, it comes into that whole debate about Eisenhower, Montgomery, who's in charge, Montgomery becoming kind of a second fiddle to Eisenhower and things like that. So kind of take us through the period leading up to the Scheldt estuary from your kind of overview point of view. Then we'll ask David to talk about kind of where the Canadian army is morale wise. But let's talk about the maps first.
Yeah, for sure. So thanks, Woody. The sort of the late summer fall is a period of highs and lows for not just the Canadians, but the Allied armies in general. The defeat of the Germans in the Falaise pocket led to the pursuit. As soon as the German army collapsed, they started running back for Germany, and the British and the Canadians and the Americans were chasing them through northern France into Belgium. And many thought that maybe the war was over because the Germans weren't standing and fighting. They'd occasionally put up a rear defensive block and fight for a little bit, but then they'd bugger off again, and everybody'd keep moving. I mean, the movement was so quick that on the 4th of September, as Arthur mentioned, the British 11th Armored Division captured Antwerp, which is a huge coup. This is the biggest, or one of the biggest ports in all of occupied Europe, absolutely essential for Allied logistics moving forward. And here, the Allies had captured it 100% intact. The Germans had been kicked out so quickly that they hadn't had time to blow any of the dock works or put sink ships in the harbor and deny it. So this was a huge coup. But the problem was it lies at the end of a 50-mile, 80-kilometer-long estuary. And until the banks of that estuary could be cleared, the port was useless. So that's the task that was given to 1st Canadian Army in this period. Now,
thank you. Sorry. No, carry on.
Yeah, so in September, 1st Canadian Army is advancing up the left flank of the Allied armies along the Channel coast, and they've been given the job of opening the ports of Boulogne and Calais and Dunkirk. Important for logistics, but too small to make a really big impact. But they were tough nuts. I mean, you have to remember these were ports that had been fortified to repel the Atlantic invasion, the Second Front. So they were very strong. They were very well defended. Now, the Canadians had the advantage of coming in from the landward side rather than attacking from the sea, but there was still substantial defenses there. I always think it's really interesting to compare the British attacking Le Havre and the Canadians attacking Boulogne. Cities that are about the same size, ports about the same size garrisons. British 30 Corps is given 2 divisions plus a sizable amount of armor from 79th Armored Division, substantial Royal Navy support in the form of monitors, 14, 16-inch guns, battleships, and massive RAF bomber support from Bomber Command, etc. And they capture Le Havre without too much difficulty. The city, of course, is flattened in the process, but that's a story for another day. The Canadians attacking Boulogne, very similar sized target, are given 2 brigades, not 2 divisions. They get some RAF support, they get no Royal Navy support, and they sort of have to make do with what they're given. And it's interesting because I think in many ways the story of September and October for the Canadian Army is very much that story, having to do a lot with not enough. And Montgomery in this period thinks that I guess I should step back. you've had lots of talk about Operation Market Garden on this show. Everybody
Yep.
knows about the bridge too far and everything like that. But for Canadian operations in the Scheldt, Market Garden was the big shadow that sort of overwhelmed everything else that was going on. That was Montgomery's focus. That was his big push. That's where all his attention was focused. And then the Canadians were sort of told to get along, go do your stuff. And Montgomery admitted after the war, he actually admitted he was wrong after the war, which is huge for Monty. His ego usually didn't allow him to do that. But he said after the war that he thought he could assign the Canadians the task of getting the Channel ports and opening the port of Antwerp while doing the Market Garden operations. But he admitted after the war that that wasn't the case. It was too much for them. And that's not a slam on the Canadians. It's a slam on them not being resourced well enough to deal with the task they'd been given.
Yeah, good point. And I think let's talk about briefly, because it's a massive, great rabbit hole, about the kind of the Eisenhower Montgomery conundrum that was facing allies in September, October. Is, that, as I've been saying a lot in the last few weeks, Patton's Third Army is all the way across in Brittany in September, but it's also pushing against the German border in Metz. There's Operation Dragooners happening. There's all the army pushing up from the south. There's a lot going on in September, August and September 44. And in the middle of this, the 1st Canadian Army, well, as we get into the Scheldt, has this command issue of its own, in that Crerar has to take a back seat because of his various ailments. And does that mean that the Canadian Army, because of the Montgomery and Eisenhower kind of discussions going on, does that mean that in some ways historians are blind to what's happening with the 1st Canadian Army? I mean, obviously Canadian historians are focused on that, but do you think that had an effect, any of you, on the wider problems of Montgomery and Eisenhower, in that one of the key assets they have is changing its leadership right in the middle of a crucial time? David?
Well, I think in this particular case, I think it kind of is a breath of fresh air. I mean, certainly that's the way the staff at 1st Canadian Army saw it when Crerar went out. Crerar was not disliked, not at all, but Crerar was a bureaucratic general. And this was something that, the staff had a hard time with. They felt that everything was kind of like a continuous series of toots, right? Tactical exercises without troops, and everything was done by committee. Well, then suddenly he goes out because he has a medical ailment, which I believe, if I'm not mistaken, might have been shingles. And he was gone for a while, but he hands over the reins to Simmons. And Simmons comes in the way he ran 2nd Canadian Corps. He comes into command. And it is a breath of fresh air. And you can see this with this various staff officers and what they have left. Just, their correspondence. They're just saying it's incredible. Everything now had to be done yesterday when Simmons came in. So that certainly does have an effect on how things are playing out in the Scheldt. And it's really tough because the morale starts to sink with the Canadian Army going into the Scheldt. And I argue it probably would have been much worse if Crerar was there because of his plodding, methodical style. Whereas in this case, you still have that same plodding style, or methodical style, I should say, not so much plodding with Simmons, but there's a sharper tone to it. And I think that certainly is something that probably would have bolstered morale when it was starting to sag quite a bit, particularly for this kind of fight, which is a World War I style infantry slog.
And just before we move on to the Scheldt, I want to talk with all of you about what impact that all those channel ports, the Boulogne, the Dunkirk, has had on the 1st Canadian Army. Because even if they weren't massively defended, or the battles for them weren't particularly gruesome, everyone is aware on that logistics. As one of you were saying earlier, that it's going to put a strain on the sidebar is talking about the Royal Army Service Corps, the repair of tanks, the repair of things like that, the mileage on the various vehicles they're using. We'll talk about the manpower in a minute, but in terms of just material, is it kind of fair to say that going into October, the Canadian Army is kind of running on fumes in terms of maintenance and repairs and vehicles and spares?
No, I don't think a huge number of tanks had broken down driving across France and into Belgium. But as things stopped and slowed down around the channel ports, the 2nd Canadian Armored Brigade repaired a large number of tanks. A large number of replacements were taken on. They had 2 armored divisions full of tanks, the 1st Polish Armored Division as well as the 4th Canadian Armored Division. So tanks, artillery pieces, anti-tank guns, all doing very, very well. The problem is the infantry. The problem is the infantry, and they very much need the month of September to rebuild themselves. And this crash retraining program is taking place in England as we speak, with all these former truck mechanics, anti-aircraft gunners, et cetera, who are suddenly told, guess what, you're in the infantry, whether you like it or not, boom. But that takes time. And the time from the Falaise Gap right until the month of October begins is when these guys finally begin to arrive, and the real reinforcements start pouring in October. But in September, it's, as I talk about in my Army of Never Ending Strength book here. Whoops, there it is. There we are. I go into detail in the reinforcement crisis, and I'll reel off just a couple of numbers for you very, very briefly here. On the 2nd of October, the 2nd Canadian Infantry Division is still 1,267 other ranks. That's non-officer short. The 3rd Canadian Infantry Division is 816 other ranks short. The 4th Canadian Armored Division is doing quite well. It's only 125 other ranks short. And just to put that in perspective, it's 850 men to an infantry battalion, roughly in October, November. An infantry company, 120 men. So the 2nd Canadian Infantry Division, there's some very strong battalions, but there's some in very, very rough shape. But the armored punch and artillery punch of the 1st Canadian Army still very, very powerful.
So, did anyone else want to join in on the Carrera and Simmons aspect? Mike does. Go on. Let's go for that.
Yeah. So I think it's important to talk about sort of the wider logistic crisis at this point during the campaign. I mean, Arthur's talked about the Canadians being in relatively good shape, but Montgomery's really pouring all of his resources into Market Garden and trying to get 30 Corps up the highway and so forth. I misspoke before. It's 1st Corps that was doing Oppistonia in Le Havre. But after they complete that, you would think they could then be brought forward as part of 1st Canadian Army to help with the fight in the Channel ports and the Scheldt, but they're not. They're grounded because they don't have enough material to support them. After a while, Montgomery realizes that those troops are needed. So the only thing he can do is keep 51st Highland Division grounded, steal all of its trucks, and use its trucks to help move 49th Infantry Division up into the fight. And then later on in the battle, the Canadians will suffer through artillery rationing. They don't have enough shells to fight. And anybody who knows how the Allied armies, the Canadian armies fight, it's an artillery first type of battle. Spend shells, not lives, to get the job done. So you're handcuffing any army that's not going to have enough shells to get the job done. And indeed, after the 2 armored divisions in 1st Canadian Army, 1st Polish and 4th Canadian, sort of get up to the edge of the Breskens Pocket, clear some of the area south of Antwerp. Both those divisions are grounded as well and take up positions sort of marking the perimeters of the area, but don't really take part in the active fighting because there's not enough to supply them, not enough fuel, not enough ammunition, and so forth. So here we are really relying on 2 divisions out of all of the resources available to 1st Canadian Army, 3rd in the Breskens Pocket and 2nd advancing north from Antwerp. So,
okay. One thing that just occurred to me is when we're talking back in the Market Garden series, we were talking about and in Falaise Gap with Dr. Paul Latowski, we were talking about sometimes Montgomery and or Eisenhower's directives being a little bit vague. Montgomery himself, obviously after Market Garden, he's reeling from the fact that hasn't gone to plan or 90% successful, and then we're going to Scheldt with Simmons now in charge of the army. Do you think the Canadians go into this campaign fully understanding what is expected of them? Is there any kind of miscommunication at this point via the commanders, or do they have a firm understanding of what's going on and what is expected of them? Because say that misunderstanding has been a kind of a broad theme we've covered on the channel in August, September, as the Allies have so many options open to them. There's lots of, well, if you can do this, try and do this. Who wants to tackle that one in terms of the priorities and whether it's all understood completely? David?
Yeah, I'm not sure that they were getting in, that they thought they were getting in over their heads. I mean, it
Right.
certainly appeared that they understood, generally speaking, what they were going to do. The terrain does change. You're moving into polder land, which is a sponge-like type of terrain, which makes it almost impossible to dig in on. So there are some terrain challenges, and also the space, if you will. It's a very open area, farm after farm after farm. So it's very, very difficult. It's not the same sort of built up areas that you were kind of coming through in the rolling, in Normandy and then up the Channel coast, which then creates issues for evacuation of wounded, headquarters facilities, things like that. But I mean, really, I think it comes down to, logistics. I mean, they're as sober as they were ever going to be about going into this. The problem was they were tasked with getting blood from a stone.
Right.
And that's the problem. And, just watching, the show the other day when you were talking about Walcheren, and you could see the problems with the Walcheren Causeway when it came to the lack of support. I mean, they didn't have a full range of artillery available. They didn't have copious amounts of smoke. They didn't have the proper air support. All these things that you could have done to be able to cross, or even engineers. You bring in the 79th, you use the funnies, and you're likely getting across that causeway in a much more efficient way. But you strip it down, you're asked to get blood from a stone, and you get a Passchendaele-like scenario. And that's kind of what we're seeing. There's a Passchendaling, if you will, of what we're seeing here. To coin a new World War II TV word. There we go. There's a new drinking game.
I like that. I'll get some merchandise with that there. And and I was thinking, as you were saying there, David, about when we were talking about the Aachen, we had the week on Aachen, and the one of the defining features of the Aachen is the Americans are throwing all sorts of extra stuff into it: tank destroyers, independent units, flamethrowers, shitloads of bazookas, anti-aircraft guns used horizontally to just send lots of lead, lots of steel downrange. Are the Canadians kind of moving into the Scheldt campaign lacking in that kind of ability to bring in extra stuff? I mean, you've just kind of said it yourself there, David. They're not under-equipped, but they haven't got any aces to play. Is that fair to say?
Yeah, I mean, part of it, I think, also has to do with terrain. You're very limited in what you can do with the breadth and the depth and the width of what you have to operate in. It's very difficult to bring guns into the particular areas and get them down.
That's true.
But one thing that the Canadians have been doing, they've been using flamethrowers effectively, particularly wasps. And that's another thing that I think we tend to forget, is that the Canadians became very adept at flame warfare. So you see that certainly down around the Leopold Canal and a few other places. And then certainly as they were pushing in, they were using that. But other than that, no, it's not an Aachen-like scenario. If you
okay. And I think Arthur, go for it.
There is a somewhat of a decision that's sort of half-hearted when it comes to the use of armor as well as technology. Now they look at the map and they do appreciations and studies, and it's all very, very bureaucratic. And 2 regiments of the 2nd Canadian Armored Brigade are cut to the British 49th Infantry Division, effectively robbing the 2nd and 3rd Canadian Infantry Divisions, apart from the Fort Garry Horse, of this use of armor. And while there is some reluctance in the Canadian Army to use armor, to say, "Oh, we just can't do this." The British are somewhat very aggressive in their use of armor where armor can be used. And well, there's many areas that are not armor friendly and very, very anti-armor. There is some parts of the Breskin Pocket where the British use a huge number of armored vehicles, Royal Engineers, as well as flamethrower tanks. The Canadians use M10 tank destroyers, all the integral organic weapons to a Canadian infantry division. But we see this sort of almost reluctance to throw a huge number of tanks at a problem, especially when it comes to specialized tanks that could have potentially lessened infantry casualties in a huge way. And thus the infantry brigade commanders are forced to use what they can to both evacuate troops, bring up ammunition, as well as attack enemy positions with M10 tank destroyers, as well as Bren gun carriers, etc., as well as the anti-tank regiments, recce reconnaissance regiments. They're all using their vehicles. Their vehicles did not disappear. And so some areas they can't use them that turn into, exactly like David said, a Passchendaele situation where they're using Pietz and Bren guns against 20 millimeter anti-aircraft guns on the Leopold Canal. And despite the amazing capability of the Wasp flamethrower, they're only good for about a 5-minute shot of their flames across there. And then once they're done, they're done. And it's up to these infantrymen to fight this battle in the Breskins pocket that for the 7th Canadian Infantry Brigade absolutely guts it in some ways. For a very, very... But then on the other side of the Breskins pocket, we have the 9th Canadian Infantry Brigade that has these terrapins and these buffaloes, and they use this excellent level of technology in the massive avalanche of, this amphibious assault that is very, very successful and eventually wins the battle or allows the Breskins pocket to fall. Which is just great. But that 7th Brigade attack, it's very much exactly like David said, a Passchendaele type struggle in this flooded areas of crawling up and down dikes and muddy half-filled holes with water where these casualties built up, and you can't use tanks. And also something that does bother me quite a bit about that 7th Brigade attack is almost an impossible task to build an armored carrying bridge for an assault crossing using tanks, and they eventually build it, but after the costs of a huge amount of infantry casualties. And by that time, the 9th Canadian Infantry Brigade attack is going so well, they sort of abandon that effort and turn it over to the British. But it's a tremendously tragic battle in that this assault crossing to bring about this armored support in the way of, some kind of armor or heavy weapons or something on tracks or wheels, doesn't happen despite the sacrifice of these infantry battalions, especially the Regina Rifle Regiment. But yeah, I'll leave it there. I've talked too much there.
Mike.
Yeah, I think this is the importance of Guy Simonds in this battle. I don't know that Carrera wouldn't have done this, but Simonds was a very innovative commander, willing to try new things to get the job done, and we saw that very clearly when we were talking about his Normandy battles and his use of kangaroos and night attacks and other things like that. And we see that again here in the Scheldt. I mean, for Operation Switchback, it's a 2-phase attack. The first is launching 7 Brigade across the Leopold Canal. That's the map you've got up there now. That was meant to be a fixing attack, a holding attack, an attack meant to draw down German reserves. And then the second, the more important part of the attack was 9 Brigade, which was going to be landed amphibiously in the rear of the German position using amphibious buffaloes to cross the Brackman Inlet, or LBT-4s for our American friends. And this was thinking out of the box. This was some innovative planning, and I think it was a really good plan. I hear what Arthur's saying, and 7 Brigade took enormous casualties in that crossing, 500 plus men killed, 200 battle exhaustion cases. But that attack wasn't supposed to last that long. They ended up getting hung out to dry for about 3 days. 9 Brigade was supposed to land much earlier, but they were delayed in getting the buffaloes down the canal because they had a problem with one of the locks. And so it wasn't until the 9th of October, 3 days after 7 Brigade had begun the battle, that they made their landing. And they landed unopposed. The Germans didn't expect it at all. The early attacks were met with little resistance, and they quickly gained a foothold and started a 2-prong attack, and the battle was essentially over for the Germans at that point. That didn't mean there wasn't a lot of tough fighting. It would take the better part of a month to slog across the polders, the flooded fields of the Breskins pocket. But that was really innovative thinking by Simonds to get that job done. And you also see it with his approach to Walcheren, and I'm sure you've talked about the sinking of Walcheren Island. I think it's important to talk about those defenses, the German defenses on the island, which were as strong, if not stronger, than anything the Allies faced on D-Day in terms of concrete positions, number of bunkers, size of guns. This was a really important position for the Germans for a number of reasons. It guarded the approach to Antwerp, but it was also very heavily fortified because it was an avenue of ingress and egress for the bomber streams going in and out towards Germany. So there were a lot of anti-aircraft positions in that area. And as we all know, those are dual purpose guns. They can be used in the air role, but they can also be then turned around and used in a ground role. So Walcheren was a very difficult nut to crack, and Simmons was trying to give his forces every advantage by sinking the island, blowing the dikes, flooding it, and hopefully making it impossible for the Germans to fight. And I think there's a whole nother story there about the impact on the Dutch, which we can talk about if you want, or save for another day. But Simmons was trying to do the most he could with his limited resources.
Yeah, well, I think sorry if I can jump in. I think that's a really good point you're making, Mike, particularly when it comes to what we were discussing earlier about command. If Harry Creer is in charge, that doesn't happen. Or if it does, it comes from somebody else. It's not from Creer. And also, even if it did come from Creer, it likely would not have carried the weight. Because at the end of the day, Simmons said, look, we won't know until we try. And I don't think Harry Creer has that kind of cachet and that kind of sway with Montgomery, whereas a Simmons can come in with his kind of talent and his record and make that decision or suggest that course of action. Harry Creer, no, not at all. He doesn't have that level of trust, amongst Montgomery.
David, I totally agree with you. But to be fair to Creer, I would say that the Walcheren plan was it was certainly being considered before he gave up his command in early September. I don't know where that plan came from. It very well may have came from Simmons, but Creer was behind that plan before he was parachuted out. But yeah, the 7 brigade, 9 brigade split, I'm sure that's 100% Simmons, not Creer.
So I'm going to jump in now, and Arthur, go for it.
Yes, there's one man that's very important. I think we're forgetting here is Major General Charles Foulkes. Now, he's thrust into the role of 2nd Canadian Corps commander, and I don't believe he's as good as Simmons. Simmons is of course, our all-star Corps commander, our excellent planner, and innovative thinker, and I believe Simmons is somewhat wasted when he's thrown into the position of Army commander, which is, overseeing things, but letting the division commanders and the corps commanders actually fight the real battles, which were they were fighting. 3rd Canadian Infantry Major General Spirey, as well as Foulkes. And Foulkes, of course, he was, very much there during Operation Spring, Operation Atlantic, and no bright light, I have to say, compared to Simmons and others. So the Creer sickness, it very much, I believe, impaired the Canadian Army because of the excellent hands-on ability of Simmons was somewhat lessened by his removal and installation as Army commander. And people say, oh, it's a breath of fresh air. It very much was. But losing him as the Corps commander in the 2nd Canadian Corps headquarters didn't help the 2nd Canadian Corps. That's my opinion anyway. And just going back to the Breskins pocket, just to address something, the 7th Canadian Brigade, that was the main attack, I believe, very strongly. Well, I know the 8th Brigade was intended to follow the 7th Canadian Infantry Brigade and charge straight north. But the success of the 9th Canadian Infantry Brigade and those amphibious landings, which were spectacularly successful, forced Spirey also, who's in charge of the actual battle, to switch 8th Brigade to the amphibious landings and to push through the Isabella Polder, abandoning sort of the 7th Canadian Infantry Brigade's front there, which were there eventually relieved by the British, I believe it's 157th Brigade there. But yes, the battle was supposed to be successfully won at the Leopold Canal, but the success was intended to be, drawing away the reserves was by the 9th Brigade. But the 7th Canadian Brigade did do its job in dragging away the reserves.
Okay, I just want to jump in and say that first I want to apologize to Norma because she's sensing a little bit of a love and respect for Simmons here, which is winding Norma up. She'll stop watching me. She'll disappear. But I'm kind of on the fence about Simmons myself personally. But are we all affected a little bit by the gradual gloominess of accounts by people who were in, for example, the 3rd Canadian Division, men of the 7th Brigade, 8th Brigade, because the accounts I've got on my shelves there, they're all kind of excited about D-Day and they're kind of all raring to go. And then you just see as June and July wears on, August wears on, and September, you were talking about the manpower shortages, but which is of course an important part of it, but that's the guys who are there have been there for months in the field now. They've had the sun on them, they've had the SS attack them, they've been under artillery strikes, and now the weather is turning bad. If you're an average Canadian corporal in, for example, the Winnipeg Rifles, Regina Rifles, do you really give a shit about who your commander is by October? You're just kind of miserable generally. Was that fair to say you at that point of the war? I certainly see that in the memoirs. There's just a little bit less patience. They're all a bit fed up. There's a little, why is it always us? Kind of is the feeling am I right about that?
Yeah, I mean, I've certainly seen the same thing, and there's no doubt about it. I mean, it's part of a larger picture too. I mean, you can say that with all the armies at this point, especially after the German collapse in Normandy. Yeah. There really is a thought that this is it. This is the final 100 days of World War II, just like, post Amiens in 1918.
Yeah.
And then when suddenly it doesn't happen, you're like, oh, for God's sakes, we got to continue this. And then you're getting into the horrible weather. And then, compound that with the Canadian army that ends up in the Scheldt, for God's sakes. Yeah. This is a horrible, horrible area to be in the fall. It's damp, it's wet, it's cold, it's miserable, and you don't see daylight. So, yeah, you can certainly see that that's, taking its effect on morale, as it would anybody, regardless of what army they're in.
Yeah. Sorry, Mike.
I was just going to say, Bill Davis, a soldier in the Black Watch after the war, called the Scheldt the dirtiest job given to the Canadian Army during the war. And I think it's all part of what David just said. It was at a point where it looked like victory was in hand, and all of a sudden they're into this nasty, heavy fighting. But the weather, it was miserable for the soldiers. The fall of 1944 was very wet. It was very cold. They're fighting in flooded fields and up to their knees or waists in muck. And it was just miserable. And the fact that they were fighting and dying at a point when maybe they thought they should be getting ready to go home makes it very difficult. So, but I mean, all that being said, I think that perhaps the Scheldt campaign was the most important campaign fought by the Canadians during the Second World War in terms of its strategic operational impact. Yeah. So, it's kind of on both sides of that dynamic.
I want to bounce off what you just said there, Mike, because when we were in the Arnhem series, obviously the ongoing question is, was Market Garden even worth doing at all? There's this big if about it. The thing about the Scheldt is there is no if. That area absolutely needs to be taken. Antwerp needs to be, although as you said earlier, that the port itself has been secured. You need to get that area north of it secure in our hands. So it's not there's no debate about it. What is the debate maybe is how it should have been handled. Could other units have gone in different directions? But there's no question about the necessity of this campaign. Whereas, for example, the Americans were kind of about to move into the Hurtgen Forest. There's absolutely a huge question about whether that was worth it or not. But we're all in agreement. This area has to be cleared. There's no question about it. We all thumbs up for that.
Yeah, without question.
Once Market Garden fails.
Once Market Garden fails.
I'm firmly in the camp that Market Garden had to be tried, because the advantage of it were really ending the war in 1941-44 if it had been successful. That it failed is really unfortunate, and we can criticize it based on hindsight. But given what they knew at the time, given the state of the German defenses, it looked like they weren't going to stand and fight. Market Garden was a great opportunity to end the war. So we can't fault Montgomery for that. We can fault him for other aspects of it. Absolutely.
Absolutely agree.
Once he got into that dogfight, trying to hold that salient, that was a nasty fight. And the Germans are flooding in troops to try to cut off the salient at its base. A lot of the troops that are escaping out of the Scheldt estuary are going across the river at Breskens, down the Beveland Peninsula, and being fed right into the Market Garden fight. So, I mean, Montgomery, you can criticize him for making the priority Market Garden, but I think he honestly thought that the Canadians would be able to get the job done without added resources. I mean, the original plan was for the Canadians to capture not just Antwerp, but go all the way up and get Rotterdam as well.
Yeah.
Have those two logistics, and it was thought to be well within the capacity of First Canadian Army to do that. And given the way that the Germans weren't standing and fighting in September 1944, at least the first 3/4 of it, that seemed entirely doable. But when the Germans decided to stand and fight, it was a whole new calculus that offset all of the Allied preparations.
Well said.
Well, we predictably divided the sidebar about whether or not Market Garden was worthwhile. I mean, I don't know that I still haven't quite decided about Market Garden, but I do definitely think it's worth going for some kind of gamble in September. Post Normandy, post the success, it's worth doing something a little bit riskier. And then when it gets into winter, you kind of go back to the more kind of grinding broad front thing. But whether or not Market Garden was the right thing, the right gamble is another debate. But as you said there, Mike, moving it, the expectation was that this could happen and the Scheldt happened. But Arthur, you want to say something?
Yes, I believe the interaction between Eisenhower and Montgomery, and it finally comes to the point where Eisenhower has to very, very bluntly give Montgomery the order that Antwerp must be freed. This port must be freed.
Yeah.
And I think Montgomery was, of course, so focused on Market Garden and actually ending the war that the supreme importance, as raised by Admiral Ramsay of the Royal Navy, of the logistic need of Antwerp. I don't think that was made clear possibly to Montgomery, or that he understood it clearly enough, or the men within his headquarters understood it clearly, that was of maximum importance for launching this invasion of Germany when it was to take place, and the absolute vital need for it. I think he misses, to the point where Eisenhower has to very bluntly step in and also shut down the Montgomery as supreme commander question, which is also is very ugly and somewhat politically touchy, considering the amount of British soldiers involved in the on the front there. So it's very unfortunate, and we're faced by this 2nd of October crisis in which Market Garden has not succeeded and Antwerp has not been freed. So it's the double whammy that somehow has to be dealt with in a huge. So Montgomery has this huge pressure that is almost crushing him, even to the point where he's showing up at Canadian Infantry Division headquarters on little lightning tours, saying, "Why isn't this happening fast enough?" He's rebuffed by Dan Spirey at the 3rd Canadian Infantry Division, saying, we're going to do this at our stage and our pace here. When he's urged very much, why isn't this particular town or village falling, and we've got to get this done, and it's got to be done yesterday. So it's very much almost crisis situation for the political standpoint of Montgomery and his standing within the eyes of the Americans.
Yeah, and rather out of character for him too, right? To be able to go down and put that kind of pressure on to move. But of course, for the Canadians in the Scheldt, I mean, you're going in now. I mean, essentially they're Plan B. And now Plan A has failed and Plan B is going in. But the Canadians, like we mentioned a little bit earlier, I mean, they've gone through a lot of tough fighting. But really what we're seeing now as we approach September and then into October is the legacy of Verrières Ridge. The incredible casualties that were taken within the infantry just haven't been made up. And, Arthur touched on it before, the idea of this conversion program where you're going to take the butcher, the baker, the candlestick maker and throw them into the front lines. That's great for filling up bodies. And even though you're still short, but you have to realize that, the guys who have been fighting have been trained as infanteers. And for those of you who may not have had that experience, it's 1,000 different little things. It's the difference between being a minor league ball player and a professional ball player. It's just, you're playing the same game, but there's 1,000 different things that come to bear. So the problem is when they're entering the Scheldt, they're getting an extremely uneven quality of reinforcements. And, like some of the accounts, and I do a lot on the Black Watch, and so the Black Watch are hit the hardest because they have taken massive casualties, not only at Verrières, but of course later on at Mayne, plus a few other little scraps on the way up. So they're not at the bottom. They're not getting everything from scraping the bottom of the barrel. They're getting from what's under the barrel in many cases. And that's not to take away from the poor guys who would get sent in, but these poor guys were coming from the postal corps, some of them. You had postal corps, you had light artillery, light anti-aircraft artillery, things like this. And now suddenly they're being thrown a rifle, probably the first one they've seen since their basic training, and they're told to go into the front lines. And this has a huge effect. And I know that there's been some controversy over, for instance, the Black Watch at what's called Black Friday, which is when they were wiped out yet again at Windsor. But you have to realize, I think somebody, and I'm not sure, Mike, correct me if I'm wrong, but I think it might have been Terry Kopp who did a study on this, because there was always this idea that the vast majority of casualties in, for instance, the attack at Windsor were these reconversions. And when he studied it, he realized there weren't. But that makes, it was actually the veterans that formed the majority of the casualties. But that makes perfect sense. Because in the fine-tuned, the fine-oiled machine, if you will, of infantry combat, it's fire and movement, which means there's a certain amount of understanding and faith that you have that the guy next to you is properly trained. So, when you're laying down the fire, or when the guy next to you is laying down the fire and you're advancing to close on your enemy, you want to have confidence, or better yet, you don't even want to think about the possibility that the guy who's laying down the fire with his Bren gun has no clue how to reload it. And this was the big problem. So it's not the reinforcements that are paying the price. It's the guys who have taken this for granted for so many years of training that their, fire support is going to be there. And then suddenly it's not. They're the ones that are caught out in no man's land, and they're the ones who are taking the pounding.
Yeah. Mike?
Yeah. David's touching on the issue of the reinforcement crisis that's facing the Canadian Army in this period, and you have to go back to planning for combat operations. And the Canadian Army had looked at what exhaustion rates would be and how many infantry reinforcements would be needed. And Normandy blew that all out of the water. They were chewing up infantry at a much greater rate, and not using other types of supply and artillery and so forth. So there was a real desperate shortage of trained infantry reinforcements by the fall of 1944. And this rose up into a national crisis for Canada. Conn Smythe is a name that Canadians might recognize, builder of the Toronto Maple Leafs, but he was a Canadian soldier in Normandy. David and your Habs. Where are they this year? But sorry, that's a rabbit hole we won't do right now. Conn Smythe went back to Canada and wrote some op-ed pieces that blew this issue wide open for the government, and there was a big scandal. Denny Whittaker, who was the commander of the Royal Hamilton Light Infantry in the Scheldt battle, was also complaining about the quality of infantry reinforcements that were being sent up. So this is a big problem that was having a major impact on the fighting efficiency of the Canadian Army at this point. And I guess the other part that is kind of goes along with this, we were talking about Montgomery and getting his head wrapped around the importance of the Scheldt. It took until the middle of October for him to make the Scheldt operation the priority. And that only happened after interventions from Eisenhower and especially Ramsey as Arthur Williams. And it was only at that point where the number of artillery shells were, the supply became reasonable. 4th Canadian Armored Division got back into the battle. The Poles got back into the battle. 1st Canadian Army was given an American division, the 104th Timberwolf Division, to fight under them to help with operations north of Antwerp towards Bergen-op-Zoom and so forth. So, yeah, there was it was a long process in terms of getting the Canadians what they needed to get this battle done, and ultimately it happened, but it wasn't a short or straight route to making that happen.
Arthur, you wanted to say something?
Yes, the 5th Canadian Infantry Brigade, and David can go into this, jump on after I, spoke my little bit here, but it's fought very, very hard in the Battle of the Scheldt. I believe it could have used a lot more in the way of armored support where tanks were suitable to be used. And units such as the Black Watch on Black Friday, as well as the Calgary Highlanders and the Black Watch, and the Regiment de Maisonneuve, all 2nd Canadian Infantry Division regiments are fought in a very, very brutal manner, in that the opposition they're facing is very fierce in the way of these German paratroopers and Sturmgeschütz assault guns, and there is some terrible casualties from this fierce German defense. There's also if you want to talk about the Walcheren, not pronouncing it right there, causeway, the British officers from the 52nd Infantry Division, some of them are watching this 5th Canadian Infantry Brigade assault across there, and they're watching in disbelief as Brigadier General, I'll say the name here, Megel, he drives one battalion after another across it, and finally the Regiment de Maisonneuves are there, and they're holding on at the last of their strength. And the 9th Glasgow Highlanders, I believe it's the 9th Battalion, the Glasgow Highlanders, the battalion commander absolutely balks when he's, ordered or looked at as the 4th Battalion to go over this causeway. And I believe sincerely this leadership of Megel is you saw him in Operation Atlantic, you saw him in Operation Spring. It's a rough deal. And of course, these are battles that need to be fought. They need to be won. The Canadian infantry had to attack, but the amount of casualties that are borne by the Calgary Highlanders, that are borne by the Black Watch, and of course, every time they lose a man, an experienced man, and the new reinforcement is thrown in, their combat efficiency, their expertise, their combat effectiveness, their ability to win battles, it's all somewhat decreased. And they don't have time to get that experience because they're going for the next attack in the next 2 or 3 days here. It's tough. It's tough. And Megel just, in front of those British 52nd Infantry officers, he does his thing there. And, of course, he is ordered to do his thing, but it's a horrible spectacle.
Yeah, he was a difficult character, to say the least. He should never have been put in command to start with, and probably should have been relieved right after Operation Spring. But he was, I think what makes it even worse is his character. He was extremely stubborn and he was insecure. And when those two things collide, disasters happen. And, he was one of there's a great account, and I think it's in interviews with Jeff Williams, and I think they're out in the Calgary Highlanders archives, if I'm not mistaken. But they talk about the fact that, if you wanted McGill to do something, tell him to do the opposite, and he'd instantly do it to spite you. He was that kind of character, and you see that particularly at the Walcheren Causeway. When they're discussing this. And that row breaks up. But, what you're also touching on, too, is also something that's very, very difficult is the morale. The morale of the Canadian Army is starting to go down. And it's very difficult for all the obvious reasons. But what I think a lot of people have missed, and it's something that I'm working on eventually when I get around to finishing the new book I'm working on and moving on to another one, I'll be dealing with Black Friday. And out of Black Friday, there are 8 members of the Black Watch who are court-martialed for desertion. And all 8 of them are put on trial right after. And 6 of them are reinforcements and 2 of them are veterans. One is a survivor of Verrières. And so, Mike, you touched on this before. All of them, or at least the 2 veterans, are dealing with basically PTSD, battle exhaustion. And at this particular point, things are so bad that probably in the weeks leading up to it, they would have been given the day off. But here, no. There's no mercy anymore. There's no thought of it. We're all in this together. And so at the end of it, they're all found guilty. They're given 8 years of hard labor. In World War I, they would have been shot. And then finally, Creer steps in and mitigates it to 3 years. And then I think most of them do a year and are let out. But that's a story that we don't really know about when it comes to the Canadians and the Scheldt. We don't really hear about it. And it gives you an idea of the kind of level that certainly the Black Watch have fallen to when it comes to dealing with what they're dealing with. And there was very little compassion. There was a general sort of compassion, but it was like, look, we're in this shit together and nobody's getting off. And
so Sorry to interrupt you. A question for all of you. You know, you're talking about, frankly, crisis point in terms of morale of the Canadian Army. We've already addressed the reinforcements issue. The other side of that, though, do you think there was collective feeling among the Canadians that if we're suffering badly, then the enemy must be suffering even worse? So therefore, if we're on our last legs, they must be on their absolute complete last legs. Because even if, as a Canadian soldier, your morale is rock bottom, you are still seeing, squadrons of Allied aircraft in the air. Maybe not when the weather's bad, but you're feeling that you're part of an army that's on the gaining the upper hand generally, whereas the German army theoretically is crumbling. So does that factor in? Do you think that there's a sense that we've only got to push a little bit more and the German army must be at breaking point? Does that make sense, Mike, for example?
Yeah, I mean, it's a really interesting question, and I've never heard or never read any Canadian soldiers talking about the low morale of the German soldiers. I mean, they had to know that they were going to win, that the Germans were going to lose by this point of the war, but there was a lot of hard fighting going on. And frankly, what they see is Germans that have all the ammunition they need, lots of machine guns, lots of artillery, continuing to put up a good fight. So I don't think they're too concerned with the German morale, because it's that old story. It doesn't matter if the soldier's scared or brave. If he's sitting behind the concrete in his bunker pulling the trigger on his machine gun, he's still spitting out death towards you. So it really doesn't matter.
Okay. Fair point.
I think part of it probably comes down to time and space, and also the kind of, advance. I think when they're advancing rapidly up the long left flank, there is a sense that this is moving fast and it's going to all come crashing down. But now you're bottled up here. You've got them bottled up. It's just a question of time. Everything now is methodical and plotting. So I don't think they really felt. I certainly have never seen anything in any of the accounts like Mike. I've never come across anything about we've got them on the ropes or anything.
Arthur, perhaps because you've studied the German aspect. Do you see that the German army is maybe on the brink of a morale crisis of its own, or do you see?
Yes, very much so. In the Breskins pocket and other places, they know there is nowhere to go. They know they're not getting evacuated to a hospital. They know that they're running out of ammunition. Every mortar bomb they fire off, that's one less that they have, and there's no more new ones coming once the South Beveland gets cut off. So it's they will eventually surrender, and the Canadians know that they're going to surrender. They know they're broken, but they will put up a fight for a significant amount of time to feel that they've done their duty and carried out their defensive duties. But for the average Canadian infantryman, it's a very rough go. And remember, they're all exhausted, they're all tired, and what they're looking at is, how do I get to the next dike? How do I get across this road? How do I get 200 meters in front of me without me eating that MG42 bullet? And how do I keep my friends and my buddies alive so we can get to that road or that dike to clear that bunker? And I'm so tired. All I care about is going to sleep. That's all I want to do. The sergeant or the corporal will give me a kick when it's our time to go, and we'll go. But that big pictureness, these guys were very much, they're looking at that road or that bunker and getting through the day. That's just my viewpoint. But
so essentially reverting back to how it was in Normandy, we had the Great Swan in between when they're kind of doing multiple towns a day in a sense, but it's now gone back that Normandy where historians are thinking about the town or the city 20 miles down the road. We're thinking about the Falaises, the Saint-Lo's, the Avranches. But if you're a soldier, as you'll say, Arthur, you're thinking about the next farmhouse, the next dike, so your world has become a lot smaller.
Yes, absolutely.
Mike?
Yeah, and I think going back to a point that Arthur made earlier about the Germans in this point in the war are having to issue their kith and kin laws or kith and kin rules. They will not surrender. If you surrender, we will go take it out on your family back home in Germany. And the fact that they have to issue orders like that says quite a bit about the state of German morale at this point in the war.
Yeah. I want to go back to something, David, you said earlier about the Scheldt campaign kind of being a plan B after plan A of Market Garden not working. And one of the recurring themes last week in the specific shows about the Scheldt was whether or not it could have all been advanced 3 or 4 weeks and achieved earlier. Do we have to kind of go back to September to kind of make any sense of that? assuming that Market Garden still happens, is there any way of advancing the schedule on the Scheldt? You said, Mike, that Ramsey has earmarked it as being very important. In fact, that came up in the discussions last week. I'll bring up the photo of or the two maps of the Eisenhower broad front strategy, the Montgomery sort of narrow front strategy. Is there an option for pushing it ahead going back to September, or do you have to change so many things to make that work, David?
I mean, look, I think it comes down to budget and cash flow. I mean,
Right.
it's logistics, and you don't have enough to do both. So the decision is made that you have to do one over the other. And if you take on the Scheldt, you abandon Market Garden, but that's the sword thrust that could end the war quickly. And I absolutely agree with what Mike said. And I realize you were hoping for us to be fighting a lot, but no, we're actually seem to be
I like it. It's a
page.
Monday morning.
I absolutely agree with Mike. I mean, this is an iron dice roll. And given everything that's happening, the final 100 days is what they think is happening. You take that chance. But to do that, you have to put all your eggs in one basket. You don't have it. And that's why the Scheldt ends up being plan B. Could it have been plan A? Sure. But at the same time, given the broader context of things, I don't know if it ever really would have been considered plan A, because that meant taking this fight potentially into 1945.
Okay. So we've got the map up there of the general situation there. We've talked about the Breskens pocket. We've talked about Antwerp. Before we kind of move to kind of the wrapping up part of it, although we're not there yet, anything more about the weeks of the last couple of weeks of October, the first week of November that you think we haven't discussed, you think is pertinent that you'd like to bring up, any of you? Breskens, Mike?
Air power, we have not talked about.
Yes, that's on my bingo card. David hasn't said Ultra, he has said Black Watch. I've got one line there, but now you've said air power. I'm close to getting a full bingo card. Air power. Let's do air power.
Yeah, you raised the question earlier about when did the Battle of the Scheldt start, and I mean, the fighting on the ground is really October into the beginning of November. You can make a case that it started in mid-September. I mean, the Algonquin Regiment tried to cross the double canal line of the Leopold on the 13th, 14th of September. And that to me, we haven't really talked about that, but that's a pretty big point, because they were still going on the assumption that the Germans are going to retreat. They might put up a small rearguard action, but then they'll run away. And at Moorkirk, they discovered, no, the Germans are digging in. They not only dug in, but they brought back reserves to push the Canadians out. And I kind of think that Crerar and Montgomery and Simmons should have read a lot more into that. I know that's sort of after the battle thinking, but it really showed that the easy times were over, that the German army's ready to stand and fight. So you could kind of say that the battle really started then. But for the air forces, the Scheldt battle was starting earlier in September, because of course the quick advance to Antwerp had cut off 15th German Army along the Channel coast in the Breskens pocket. And there were some 80 to 100,000 men that were trapped there. They had no land bridge to get back to rejoin the rest of the German army. So they had to improvise an ad hoc evacuation across the Scheldt estuary. Most of the troops went from Breskens to Flushing or Vlissingen, but there were other routes going across as well. And the Air Force was brought in to try to stop that, to try to hit those ferries and small craft that were going across. And they made every effort to do it. They attacked the port of embarkations, Breskens and Terneuzen and Flushing, where they were landing. But in the end, they didn't get to stop the German army. And that's often raised as one of the big questions. Why didn't they stop them? Why didn't they block them at the base of the Beveland Peninsula? Why didn't 2nd Division push forward quicker to cut off their supply and trap the German army there? And it's an interesting question. I mean, maybe they could have. I don't think they had anywhere near the strength to do it. But what would have happened if you had 80,000, even 60,000 Germans trapped in the Breskens pocket? Antwerp's not opening till 1945, if you're lucky, if you have to defeat them that way. So maybe them escaping was the best thing. Hate to say that, because like I said, they were thrown into the Market Garden battle, but it's never a zero-sum game. There's always some give and take about what's going on. But air power is being used to support 1st Canadian Army during this period. I think there's a lot more that needs to be written, because we tend to look at it through our individual stovepipes. We look at the Army story, we look at the Air Force story, but we really need to look at the combined story. How were they working together? How were they on the same page? Were they not on the same page? So the story of the sinking of Walcheren's been told a lot. There's a lot going on there. But 1st Canadian Army was using air power in other ways to support their battles in the Brescan Pocket, their advance up north of Antwerp. They were using Bomber Command to hit the bigger targets like Brescans and Flushing and those big gun batteries. They wanted more resources. The Germans at this point kind of thought that there wasn't really a big battle going to happen until Bomber Command or the U.S. 8th Air Force got involved. Bomber Harris, the commander of Bomber Command, was supportive, and I say this with a big asterisk, was supportive of helping the Army, but he really thought of it as a distraction from his main job, which he thought was to bomb Germany back to the Stone Age and win the war himself without reference to the Army. But he always supported the Army. He always encouraged the Army to request, but then he would also hammer them, saying, "You're what were the famous words? You're drunk on air support," or like that, and didn't want that distraction. So it was kind of a give and take there. But air power was essential to what the Canadians did, and I would argue that it wasn't central to the victory, but victory wouldn't have happened as quickly or as easily without air support.
Okay, well, while we're on the subject of air support, one of the comments that came up last week was the use of the Lancasters bombing the dike on Walcheren. And that, throw that photo up there. So opinion was divided last week. Tobias, our Dutch expert, was of the opinion that and I'm not talking about the impact on the Dutch civilians, I'm talking about the advantage it did or didn't give to the attacking forces. Tobias was of the opinion that it probably didn't favor the attacker at all, and it actually made the defenders a little bit easier. Stephen Fisher was more of the opinion that it did attack, help the attackers. Do any of you have any firm opinions on the bombardment in advance, Arthur?
I believe it was absolutely spectacular and absolutely critical to the success of the British Army and the British Commandos in their successful assault. And their assault was so successful, and they even landed some tanks, which helped the British there to swarm around Walcheren Island. And the outstanding success and part played by the British Army during the Battle of Scheldt, I think, is downplayed. There's magazines like this, Canada and the Scheldt campaign.
Yep.
It is very much, it's very much an all Canadian type thing, but the British were absolutely spectacular in their Walcheren Island assault, with the British Royal Marine Commandos doing a wonderful job, and they swarm over all parts of the island. And the German commander of the island's defense is interviewed after the hostilities, and he says it's the flooding that really did us in, because it was the communication from bunker to bunker that was impaired by this water everywhere, and it reduced the amount of space that the British had to conquer. And arguably, even though it's very unpleasant for me to say, I don't believe the Walcheren causeway assault had to take place. I believe the British Army was doing so well, and with its assets and swarming around all the areas, why exactly did that that chunk of land on the other side of the causeway need to be captured? Why it's you see the British, they're sort of running around the border of the island and doing a very good job, and it happens relatively slowly and relatively painlessly. Apart from the British Royal Navy, they show up with a support flotilla with all these anti-aircraft guns and 17-pounders put on the landing craft, and a bunch of them get sunk, and this huge almost naval sea battle is fought, where they have a hell of a time. But the in the meantime, the British Commandos and the British 52nd Infantry Division, they're doing a great job, and they succeed, and they win the frickin' battle. They do a good job.
Okay, David or Mike, opinions on the bombardment? Brad, by the way, OTD Militaries is saying he believes the bombing helped the Germans more than the Allies. So we're not resolved yet. Do we have a casting vote for David or Mike?
I mean, Mike's probably, look, they didn't know what was going to happen, and they were going to do it no matter what to see. So, I mean, here we are sitting later. I mean, I guess we can still flip a coin. I mean, Arthur makes a great case. There's no doubt about that. and especially coming from the German perspective. But I don't know. I mean, I can see now by taking a look at the map, and I agree with you, Arthur. I don't think the causeway assault was needed. I mean, you could have just sat there and, in theory, let them come to you instead. Especially when you know you have the landings going on and they're going to be, they're going to be squeezed. They're not going anywhere. But again, clock is ticking. Comes down to time. Every day lost. Every day that has a rippling effect with logistics.
Mike?
Yeah, I'll come down firmly in the middle on this one. I think that
playing the historian card there. Well, there's value to both sides. Yeah.
I think the plan wasn't nearly as successful as Simmons had hoped that it could be. I think the plan was that they would flood out all of the bunkers and make them impossible to fight from. And it certainly didn't do that. It certainly isolated them. It cut off communications, as Arthur meant. It made it much more difficult to get around. But I think if you had a coordinated defense from all those German positions on Walcheren that were fully in communication, fully cooperating, fully working together, I think it would have been a very different story for the commando landings on the 1st of November, and it would have been perhaps a much more problematic story. So I don't think it helped the Germans, like Brad said. I mean, I can't really see how it helped the Germans. They couldn't get around. It was more difficult to reinforce. It was more difficult to resupply the positions. I think that it slowed down their response. It helped the Allies in terms of isolating those positions and dealing with them. So I think it was kind of in the middle. It wasn't as successful, but it certainly was in the plus column for the Allies. I think it's worth talking though about the costs on the Dutch civilians for that attack, because that's a big part of it, and it's one that was really debated on the Allied side before the attacks ever went on. I mean, here you are bombing the homeland of one of your allies, and you're going to cause civilian casualties. And there were feelings that if you were going to sink the island, you might destroy it as an agricultural area for all time by letting the salt in on the fields. And as it turns out, that didn't come to pass. It took just a couple of years till the fields were back and fully sort of as rich as they were before. But the bombings, maybe not the flooding, because the flooding was very slow, but the bombings itself killed a lot of Dutch civilians. I don't know if anybody's been to West Capelle, but the little village where one of the breaches in the dike was made is dominated by this old lighthouse that's at the back of the town. See it in any photograph from the period, and that lighthouse is still there and overlooking the village. But if you go to the lighthouse, and behind the lighthouse there is this large memorial to the civilian victims of the war, and I forget the exact number, but it's something like 152 names are commemorated in a field there, and they range in age from the elderly to 1 and 2 year olds, and it's absolutely devastating to see the cost. And I believe these are their losses for the war, but the vast majority of them were killed in the bombing attacks to breach the and that's terrible, and that's a cost that was repeated throughout the Scheldt, sometimes from the bombings, sometimes from the fighting. But if you go to any of the small Dutch towns in the Breskens pocket, they'll always have a memorial with the names of those that were killed during the war, and you know that the vast majority died during September, October, and November 1844. So it was a terrible cost. Liberation has a price.
Well, absolutely, and thanks for reminding us of that. And it would be boring if we all had a complete consensus. So to give a representation of the views, Sheldrake is saying we have amphibious vehicles and they don't, so flooding is to our advantage. Brad, limited avenues of advance for allies are a big part for me. So we're not completely in agreement over that. Mike's somewhere in the middle, I'm somewhere in the middle, Dave. But what we can talk about now a little bit is that, you know, you said yourself earlier about the Walcheren charge itself, the causeway charge, whether or not it was 100% necessary. Just to kick us off this next part of the conversation, Sheldrake is saying it was a diversion from the Infatuate 2 landings vital, but in hindsight, of course, it may not have been necessary. So is that a fair way to approach it, that at the time it seems absolutely essential to be a diversion attack, but afterwards perhaps not so? Is that a valid point, Arthur, do you think?
I think with the flooded nature of the island here, the Germans could not move their reserves around, even if they wanted to. What they've got, on the coast is what they've got. It's not going anywhere. So and of course the defenses on the other side of the island, or one side of the island and on the other side of the causeway, are quite powerful. Simply leaving them there or just annihilating them through days of artillery bombardment or airstrikes, I think is preferable. And also, we have to think of the Canadian Army in the year 1944, in November 1944. It's still all volunteer. Conscription has not come yet. Ralston has not resigned yet as the Minister of National Defense. So this all volunteer army fighting it the way 5th Brigade fights it, it's tremendously wasteful when the number of infantry reserves are limited. And this is something that, is very much also a factor that is not, I believe, ignored by the soldiers at the front, the Simmons and the McGills and the Folks. They continue on fighting just as hard as they want to at times. But with this all volunteer army, the number of infantrymen to replace those lost is a check that can't be cashed. It's very, very much that should be in the back of the mind of the 2nd Canadian Infantry Division commander at this time. How many more of these guys, have I got? Many more times can I do this? So it's very much a limiting factor on the Canadian Army as a whole at this period of time. Not often ignored by the Canadian commanders, but it's still there. So yes, it's maybe fighting in a manner that we can't really go as hard as we want to go at this particular time. But that's just my 2 cents.
David, charge necessary or not?
Unnecessary. I mean, I suppose if you're creating a diversion, there's other ways of getting their attention and trying to get it without necessarily throwing an entire brigade down a narrow way. And if you are going to do this, then you have to bring in overwhelming firepower. I mean, in theory, you've got a very narrow front, which means you can then pack in as much firepower as humanly possible. And it just doesn't seem that they did that. Now, they certainly didn't, I should say. But the question is that because it was diversionary in nature, or was it because of logistics were tying their hands? Probably a bit of both. Also, too, we have to look into that specifically with the planning. And I'll be honest with you, I have not. But I know in the massaging of history coming out of Simmons headquarters and McGill being part of this as well, there was always a possibility that the intent which they assigned afterwards was never there in the planning to start with. So again, I'll reserve final comment because I haven't gone down that road, yet in the research. But given the past history of it, it requires further examination. Let's just say that.
Okay, Mike.
Yeah, I mean, I think early in the planning stages, the assumption was that if you were advancing on Walcheren from the east, that the only way onto the island was across the causeway. Now, 52nd Lowland Division was fed into the battle, and their 156th Brigade found a way across the mud flats and managed to get onto the island without going across the causeway. So I don't think that was planned early on, but they found a way to do it. So there were other options. That being said, who knows if the Germans hadn't been fixed at the sort of the entrance to the causeway, if that other option for the British would have been available. Again, that's kind of a sort of the after the fact kind of assumption, but there are other ways to do it, and maybe a holding attack on the causeway to draw the Germans' attention would have been enough, not having to keep feeding Canadians into that meat grinder to dying in a really, really difficult battle.
Yep, Arthur.
Yeah, and later in the South Beveland battles, the Fort Garry horse is driven across. Now, during this Walcheren, how do you say it again? Walcheren. Well, yes.
I say Walcheren, but
Walcheren. Yes, they do have an armored engineer dozer driving around on the causeway, and it's trying to fill in this bomb crater that's right in the middle of it, and it's driving around until it gets shot at by an 88 millimeter gun or an anti-tank gun that's on the other side of the causeway. But what was really to lose by deploying a lot of these armored vehicle Royal Engineers or other specialist armored vehicles, or dragging them up And if 10 or 11 of them, or even 12, or even a squadron of tanks was destroyed charging across, it, maybe 2 crewmen each from each tank get to be casualties, but that would mean a lot less infantry that are shot and killed in this process. So it's the use of technology in this particular case, in this battle, it's not exactly evident. It's very much like David says, sort of a Passchendaele style charge. It gets very, very ugly. Looking back with 2020 hindsight, they could have done this and they could have done that, and it goes on and on.
Well, that's what they pay us for, right?
Yeah.
And I think
that's the thing. Sorry, let me just jump in one thing. I mean, going back to it, the 52nd Division finds a way upstream. They find a way of doing this. So if you do
but as Sheldrake said, only after the pressure was off, the attention had been elsewhere, so they had a bit more time to do that. But I'm thinking that what Brad said on Friday is that with those multiple charges of multiple companies down that causeway, if they had just tried one and then pulled back, the Germans wouldn't have buggered off for at least 12 or 24 hours. They'd think, well, there's going to be another one coming. Would that have been enough? Again, with hindsight, with 2020 vision, would that have been enough to route the Germans to the other side of the causeway and then let the landings happen over to the west anyway? But then it's easy to predict these things, I say, after the event. It's doing it in advance is the tough thing. So what I want to bring it to now to kind of
sorry, if I can make one point before we move on.
Please do.
Most of the cratering on the causeway was caused by the Allied air forces. Yeah, because that was one of their main targets during the attempt to stop the evacuation of German 15th Army. So, in fact, the Dutch Mitchell wing was one of the main units that was attacking, trying to cut the rail line there to slow down or stop the egress of the German troops.
Okay, thank you. I want to bring it now to gradually wind things up. What's the state of play for the 1st Canadian Army after the capture of Walcheren? Where are they now? With the manpower crisis has not yet been fully resolved. There's now been some more hits taken here. What's the state of play going into the rest of November and into December?
Well, they're now moving into the Nijmegen salient, and this becomes, pretty much, for most of November, December, January, this becomes the absolute, breather that they needed. They're able to absorb reinforcements. Even the ones that are coming in, the conversions, are now becoming properly trained. They create a whole series of battle schools right around the Quake area, at least for 2nd Canadian Division and others as well. So there's this incredible pause that is needed. And one could argue that the Canadian Army that comes out of that and into the Rhineland is a completely different army than what went into the Scheldt in 1944.
Yeah, there's essentially after the Scheldt operation is completed, there's still some operations. 4th Division is fighting north of Antwerp into Bergen-op-Zoom and further north there. But really, until Operation Veritable, the 8th of February, the Canadian Army is out of the line. It's not doing any major fighting. It doesn't get drawn into the Operation Battle of the Bulge. Fighting in December and January, and it really has a long period of time to sit and lick its wounds, to rebuild, to reintegrate reinforcements, to do that training that has been so sadly lacking. David's exactly right. I've been looking at air support for 1st Canadian Army, and there's a whole series of seminars that are taking place in that period of December, January, where you see Air Force officers going not just to 1st Canadian Army headquarters, but to the division headquarters, the brigade headquarters, even down to the battalions, and talking to them about air support. And that's essential communication and cooperation to make sure everybody's on the same page and talking about how air support works and how we can do this better and what do you need, what do we need, so forth. So yeah, it's a really important pause. And I think David's exactly right. 1st Canadian Army comes out stronger, better, more effective because of this long pause.
Yeah, as much as we can criticize them for dropping the ball when it comes to the reinforcement crisis, that certainly is not the case here. They're absorbing the lessons learned. Yeah, and that's, I think, what Mike is talking about. And you can see it all the way, right from the top, all the way down to basic field craft. It's amazing what they're doing. But again, it comes with that pause, that absolute essential pause.
No, definitely. You give me the idea for an Operation Veritable next part of this discussion come February next year, and just sort of in advance of that, one could maybe argue that as you say, the Canadian units are going into Veritable stronger, having had a bit of a break than perhaps the 15th Scottish are, who've basically been in the line all the way through 43rd West, 53rd. Welsh division kind of have been fighting on through the winter and in a little bit of a poorer state by the time we come to Veritable. That's another discussion for later on. But Arthur, you wanted to add something about the state of the army at this point.
Yes, even though the huge number of infantry casualties are occurring, they come out of the Battle of Scheldt much stronger. So I got, what is the figure here for the 3rd of November? The 2nd Canadian Infantry Division is 858 other ranks short. The 3rd Canadian Infantry Division, always better, it's only 776 other ranks short. This is other ranks infantry, non-officer. And on the 3rd of November, the 4th Canadian Armored Division, 615 other ranks infantry short. But it's not bad. It's still, 2,249 people short, but still they've been dumping them in as fast as they've been losing them. So actually the Battle of the Scheldt, even though you wouldn't think of it, it's a huge rebuilding process. And there's 2 regiments of the 2nd Canadian Armored Brigade that virtually miss the heavy combat, the 1st Hussars as well as the Sherbrooke Fusiliers, and they're completely rebuilt, and they get all these new 17-pounders and a load more tanks, so they're ready to go. So this, exactly like David and Mike say, this Operation Veritable that is coming, this February 1945 thing that's going to happen, it's an entirely new Canadian army, a current army that is rested, that's lives outside in ruined houses, and it's a little bit rough, but they're still not in heavy combat apart from patrols. And no, this is very much a time, a Christmas 1945, which despite the crisis of the Battle of the Bulge and oh my gosh, here come the Germans, the Canadian Army uses this time to very much rebuild. It does not take heavy casualties in November, December, some parts of January, so that and then conscription comes in, so they're ready to go come February for Veritable. They're very much let's get at her, and they're all systems go and more powerful than they've ever been. And even more power comes in February and March when the 1st Canadian Corps arrives via Operation Goldflake, which sees the 1st Canadian Army united and ready to drive into the Netherlands, to drive into Germany.
Yeah.
There's also a big change in attitude. They are tired, they're exhausted in the fall, but after that rest, going into Germany, they're very aware, the Canadian soldiers are, that they're going in as conquerors. They're not going in as liberators. And that you can see the attitude change and some of the fighting, to say the least. It becomes quite nasty as they move into Germany. But again, as Arthur mentioned, probably the most powerful the Canadian forces have ever been, or at least the Canadian Army has ever been, is in the last 3 months of the war. I can't think of any other time. And yes, having the combat veterans of Italy now joining them, it's quite the instrument that the Canadian Army is wielding in the field by the end of the war.
Well, it's interesting to cover what we were saying at the beginning, is that you learn the most through adversity. And the Great Swan, which was an impressive military achievement, maybe wasn't the learning curve, but the Scheldt estuary has been the learning curve. That, as you say, they come out of this stronger, better motivated with the end game in sight. But before we bring things to kind of final end, anything about the kind of the legacy of the Scheldt that annoys you, or you think the focus is in the wrong place? Do we talk too much about the causeway, enough about the Breskins pocket? Is there something that a kind of final point each of you want to make before we end?
Yeah, I can start on this. I think, when people talk about the Canadians in the Scheldt, which is rarely, it tends to get overlooked in favor of Market Garden. When they talk about it, it kind of focuses on a few key points: the landings of Operation Switchback, the attacks north of Antwerp, especially Wansdrecht and Hoogerheide, etc., and then on to Walcheren. But that was an entire month plus of really heavy fighting that it took to complete the capture of the area. And it was nasty, it was ugly, it was costly, and it wasn't just a few days of fighting. It was the better part of 5.5 or 6 weeks of intense combat. And I think it's important that is remembered. And yeah, I mean, I agree 100% with Brad. Anybody talking about the Scheldt is good, because again, I think that it is probably the Canadians' most important campaign of the Second World War. I mean, Normandy, we cut our teeth and did a great job. Operation Veritable and the Rhineland operation was a really impressive battle. But the Scheldt was one that had bigger ramifications. It was a tough battle. It was a hard-fought victory, but it was also a victory that was absolutely essential for the conduct of the war. Without Antwerp, the Allied armies are going to be in a really dire straits for their logistical supplies, and so Antwerp had to be captured, or opened, I guess is a better way of saying it, and the Canadians were key to getting that job done.
Arthur?
I believe the use of technology was absolutely critical, and it showed its importance during the Battle of the Scheldt. The terrapins, the buffaloes, the flamethrower tanks, the armored vehicle Royal Engineers, and you see in the tougher portions of the Battle of the Scheldt where the Canadian infantry is pummeled at times, is that where the technology is missing. And despite whatever environment you're in, that technology is absolutely necessary for success, be it on water or in a marshland, or a farmer's field, or the plains of south of Caen and in Normandy. That use of technology wins the battles and bludgeons the Germans down. And you see it when the 4th Canadian Armored Division arrives on the flank of the 2nd Canadian Armored Division, and they turn things around and charge right forward to Bergen-op-Zoom and cut off South Beveland. It's that power, that combined arms power, as well as the power of the aerial bombardments, the massive airstrikes on Walcheren Island. And I believe very much strongly, the more I teach it, the more I teach these military history courses where I work at RMC, that the losses incurred on the Canadian infantry are very, very tragic. And this is something that's, has to be mitigated both now and in the future. These battles have to be won. Technology has to be utilized to defeat the enemy and bludgeon them down. And in where we abandon that technology, I believe difficulties can occur.
David?
Yeah, I think it comes down to, kind of something what I mentioned before, and, certainly taking both of your points are well taken. Both of them are well taken. And, as Mike, you said, this is incredibly strategic contribution that the Canadians are making. But you think of the concept of blood from a stone, and, something that is so important that in some cases the Canadian Army is now coming into this with, I don't know if one hand tied behind the back is the right way of doing it, but certainly not with everything that they needed. Yet they're prevailing through all of this. That is quite remarkable. But that also comes with an incredible human toll. And I think that's the one thing that, at the end of all this, us armchair generals can sit here, but, it all comes down to that human toll, which was incredible physically and psychologically.
Well, that's a perfect way to end it, I think. And my learning curve is this, has been extraordinary on Scheldt Week. And Mike, the point you made about it being, if not one of the most important Canadian battle of the war. And I think, so from my point of view, this is certainly one where the Canadians are, if you use a movie analogy, you're the names above the title of the movie. Yeah, not to discount the British Commandos, Royal Marine Army Commandos, the importance of the Royal Navy. You're kind of the main star of this campaign, whereas Normandy, you're part of an all-star cast, so to speak, in Normandy, whereas the Scheldt really is a Canadian operation to which other units are participating, not notably the Polish Armored Division as well. But I think that's my takeaway as well, is that it gave the Canadian Army a chance to kind of prove its worth of combined arms and technology, but also, as David said, it came at this cost of human lives, and also those that weren't killed, but as you've all been saying, the morale hits, the individuals took, the weather, the bitterness, the one dike after another dike after another bunker after another bunker. I think that will be a legacy. But we will bring it to an end there. But I will invite you back, if not before, for a veritable panel in February. We'll do a veritable week or two then. But it's been a fantastic talking to you, folks. Gavin Mortimer joins me tomorrow to talk about Paddy Mayne in Sicily, so one of the raids at the beginning of Operation Husky. But it's been a great, fantastic conversation. Thank everybody for your conversations and chats in the sidebar. We didn't get to many of the questions because it's hard on a panel discussion. But I will see you all again tomorrow. This is Paul Woodedge for World War II TV and my three musketeers of Canadian history saying I will see you all next time. Cheers, everybody. Bye.
Bye, guys.
Everyone, cheers.
Bye-bye.